Hey, Andrew Austin of the FAR Podcast. This is the podcast or vlog associated with the Freedom and Reason blog. You can read my blog at andrewaustin.blog. If you're watching on YouTube, you can see the address there on the screen, andrewaustin.blog. I want to invite you to visit the blog, to subscribe, comment if you're so inclined. You'll find there around 450, probably more than 450 now, essays, lengthy essays on race, class, religion, and a myriad of other topics. I am in the process of setting up a podcast, so I'm simultaneously recording this in a podcast format. I'll tell you about that when that's all set up. I'm also transitioning to a dedicated YouTube channel for my podcast. When I started doing this, part of this grew out of wanting to make my online lectures better. I teach that we went to an all online format at the university I teach at for summer school, and as well as the winter interim. And so I wanted to make those more appealing by doing video lectures rather than PowerPoints with voiceovers and that sort of thing. And then the COVID thing hit, and we didn't come back after spring break, and we went online. And so I started acquiring various pieces of podcasting equipment in order to do a better job there. And so I put together a studio. And so now that they're a little bit more professional, and they'll get more professional as time goes on, I want to set up a dedicated channel. So I will let you know about that too, so we can get the subscribers switched over to a new channel. And then I will keep this channel up, but I'll just archive it. What I want to talk to you about today is the problem of anti-racist training in the workplace, and anti-racist training, or what's sometimes called diversity training, for students and for faculty, for administrators, and so forth. The diversity training model, there's various models, but the idea that workers and students and teachers and so forth need to be socialized into a way of thinking about diversity has been around for quite some time. Sensitivity training, all these things. Probably a lot of you have been through this or certainly heard about it. There's been a movement within diversity training. What do you want to call it? A movement? Maybe adventure. There's been a movement within that to roll out critical race theory, anti-racist training of that sort. And that comes with a particular character, and I want to talk about that, and that goes along with all the other things that are happening in our country with anti-racism, Black Lives Matter, and so forth. So I have a document that was sent to me, and this is from 2003, and I did ally work in the first decade of the 2000s, and I was sort of on board this sort of stuff. What I did with ally training was talk to minority students about how to deal with the police, because the police shoot a lot of people in the United States every year, and I felt it was very important for people to understand how to deal with the police. And at the time, this was before 2016, when the whole string of studies came out showing that there is not racial bias. There's no systemic racism in policing, but at the time we were all operating under the assumption that there was. And so I felt it was particularly important. But it's important even if there isn't racial disparity, because everybody needs to know how to deal with the police. When I do that training now, I do it in my classrooms, and everybody gets that. Everybody gets that training. It's important stuff to know. I've blogged about it, so you can check that out. And so I was sent this document from 2003, and it says, please do not duplicate further, which I always find interesting. It's sort of, we're going to give this, whether this is because it certainly has a copyright attached to it. It's by Francis E. Kendall, and the title of it is How to Be an Ally If You Are a Person with Privilege. So how do you know you're a person with privilege? Well, take a look at your skin color. Is it white? Then you're a person with privilege. And I'm not going to read it, but just a couple of things. And I'm just using this as a way into this topic. So what do allies do? Well, they work continuously to develop an understanding of the personal and institutional experiences, the person or people with whom they are aligning themselves. If the ally is a member of a privileged group, it is essential that he or she, it says she or he. I always do these things alphabetically, so this just to avoid the appearance of kind of politics. But anyway, she or he, identity politics, I should say. I don't want to avoid the appearance of politics. Strives for clarity about the impact of privileges on her or his life. So what would that look like? Well, one is consistently asking myself what it means to be white in this situation. So you're supposed to think whenever you're in a situation, you're interacting with people of color, you're supposed to be thinking while you're doing that, what does it mean to be white in this situation? I'm white. What does that mean? Well, how would I be experiencing this if I were a person of color? So they're asking you to imagine if you were a person of color, how would you experience it? You can't know. It's an essential experience. That's the whole problem, right? That people of color have a particular view of the world. But you're supposed to imagine how you would experience it. Would I be listened to? So the idea here is that you're supposed to, I guess, assume you wouldn't be, because this is a racist society and people don't listen to people of color. So I need to, as a white person, recognize that I am listened to because I'm white. If I wasn't white, would I be listened to? Probably not. Not like I am when I'm white. Would I be getting the support I'm getting now? How would my life in this organization be different if I were not white? Male, heterosexual, tenured, a manager. We can add cisgender to this, and because the list is growing. So that's just an example. So we're supposed to not think of people as individuals, not think of ourselves as an individual. We need to think of ourselves as a white person, and then adjust our attitudes and behaviors with respect to that recognition. So allies choose to align themselves publicly and privately with members of target groups and respond to their needs. It's a little odd, the target group phrase. Now this was again 2003, is right when the first decade of the 2000s, right when I got out of graduate school in 2000, got to the university, began to experience the institutional side of this discourse. Of course, my background in sociology and political economy and criminology in the 1990s meant that I got a heavy dose of critical race theory, of critical legal studies, feminist legal studies, and all these things. So I was quite aware of the what I would regard as the ideology behind this. So this may mean breaking assumed allegiances with those who have the same privilege as you. So you might say, well, maybe white people aren't going to like it that I'm going to be a race traitor, and I'm going to be an ally to non-white people. So what might this look like? Stepping into a situation in which a person of color is being overrun by someone who looks like you. So John, a white man, I think Eugene, who's a Filipino, is making an important point. Would you hold your comment for a second so I can hear what Eugene has to say? I regard this as really patronizing and infantilizing. As if Eugene needs help in being able to articulate his point. In any case, I'm not going to go any more into this. But this is rather mild to where we are now. If you look at some of the approaches that are taken now, it's all white people have privilege and are racist. That white people can't don't exist outside of the structure of white supremacy. So white supremacy isn't anymore people with pointy hats or swastika armbands, those aren't white supremacists anymore. We're all white supremacists because we can't step outside of the parameters of whiteness. This is a country in which social class is not to be thought of as the primary relation. Economic relations are not the primary relations. It's race which organizes the world, and then step down from there, race, gender, and it's a hierarchy of intersectional relations, boxes along color, along gender, sexual orientation, and so forth. And when you say it's a hierarchy, I think we got a really great example of the hierarchy recently. A man named Jacob Blake, who was being arrested for a warrant that was out for felony sexual assault. He raped somebody, and not once but multiple times over a number of years, in some cases in front of the victim's child, had taken the victim's keys, had children in a car, was either had a knife and was trying to attack a police officer. They'd already wrestled with him on the ground. He'd gotten up. He got away. They had tased him. They tried that. He got away from that. There's a picture. It appears that he has a knife. A knife was found in the car. He could have been trying to get in the car and drive away and take the kids. Whatever, the police had to take action. And they, in my view, and I've looked at the video several times and studied the circumstances, looks like a lawful use of deadly force. Jacob Blake was not killed. He survived. And now Jacob Blake is a hero for the Black Lives Matter movement. They're organizing a big march in Milwaukee. His family is Justice for Jacob. And it's so the whole Me Too thing, has just been trumped by this. So the NFL and other sports teams now have taken, when the NFL, they actually have Jacob Blake's name on their helmet. When just last year and the year before, the NFL was trying to address the problem of domestic violence and violence against women. So Black Lives Matter is all consuming. Now, so I want to talk about race then. And I want to, before I do that, I have some prepared text. I'll try not to read to you, but I want to organize. I want to be really clear about the situation that we're in, so that we can discuss then diversity training and anti-racism training against the background of reality. And so in order to understand what we mean by reality, we have to differentiate that from fantasy. And, there have been structures in American history which have worked on the basis of race. There's no question about that. And if there are structures, not just in the United States, but in South Africa and other places, there have been these structures. It's morally incumbent upon those who benefit from the organization of this, the organizations associated with this structure, to work with those who are oppressed by it. So, in a sense, that would be what an ally would be. You would have a racist structure, and you would organize with those who are oppressed by it. You'd work within the conditions for all those affected, right? And in the name of racial justice, you would strive for equality. So if you have a structure that prevents black people from having the same opportunities that white people have, you want to dismantle that structure. And if an oppressor group refuses to change, then there's a range of protest actions that can occur, and they're justified, right? So during Jim Crow segregation, the civil rights movement engaged in nonviolent action, protest action, acts of civil disobedience, disobeyed unjust laws, and so forth, and those were justified. Of course, the police came and enforced the law and carried civil rights activists off to jail, and that was part of the deal. Martin Luther King understood that if you were going to break the law, to protest the law, you were going to suffer the consequences, but you were morally in the right. And if those protests are insufficient to bring about change, then violence may be warranted. We're not going to rule violence out completely. I mean, there were slave rebellions, and slave rebellions were justified because nobody has to suffer. Nobody has an obligation to suffer slavery, and you can rise up against the slave master. So violence is justifiable, but it has to be of last resort. And you try to get your freedom, you try to get your rights, and you use peaceful means to do that. And if those peaceful means don't result in liberation, in emancipation, then in a change in the law, etc., then violence may be warranted, and then you have to carry out violence in an ethical way. And I'm going to get into that discussion. I've talked about that before on my blog. But what I want to say here is that the American Republic has demonstrated over many decades a remarkable ability to address the problems of racism it inherited. In one instance, tragically, with catastrophic war. But the Act of 1807, which was passed in March, and that's significant because it was said that that the slave traders had 9 months to get their house in order because they were going to bring the slave trade to a conclusion. The U.S. Congress gave all slave traders 9 months to close down their operations in the United States. And the trade was in black Africans, and it was racist in character. After January 1st, 1808, the act declared it unlawful, to quote from the act, to import or bring into the United States or the territories thereof from any foreign kingdom, place, country, any Negro, mulatto, or person of color with intent to hold, sell, or dispose of such Negro, mulatto, or person of color as a slave or to be held to service or labor. In quote. So within 2 decades of its founding, the United States forbade its role in the transatlantic slave trade. That's very significant. A little more than half a century later, the 13th Amendment abolishing chattel slavery in the United States was proclaimed. And unlike the abolition of the slave trade, the change came after a long fought civil war that claimed the lives of more than 1 million Americans, hundreds of thousands of them soldiers, some 600 to 750,000. So we had a civil war over this question. It was significant that we were able to end slavery. So within the first 100 years of the country's founding, abolished the slave trade, abolished chattel slavery. Within a century, segregation by race would be abolished, and this time relatively peaceful. And this was led by a coalition of blacks and whites engaging in civil disobedience and pushing courts to do the right thing, pushing politicians to do the right thing. The Civil Rights Movement was a powerful statement of the American creed of colorblindness. And colorblindness doesn't mean not seeing color. I'm hearing people say that a lot. It's not what it means. It means that all persons should stand equally before the law. And so if you ask me, what kind of civil rights advocate are you? I'm a civil libertarian. I believe in civil rights and human rights, in that all individuals should be regarded as such, as persons and autonomous individuals before the law. And I talked about that in my last podcast, and how critical race theory wants the law to proceed on a group-based rights as opposed to individual-based rights. And group-based rights is what we tore down when we tore down Jim Crow segregation. So it's important to keep that in mind. So the United States is now experiencing, after this remarkable history, which really demonstrates the validity of the American Republic in solving these problems. I'm remembering, the notion, the original civil rights notion that constitutional remedy, democratic procedure, regarding human personality, regarding all people as one, the integrationist notions. I'm remembering those as really a reflection of the nature of republicanism and what we should strive for. But despite that, despite those values, despite that creed and those accomplishments, the United States we're now hearing that the United States is this profoundly racist country and that we're undergoing a reckoning on the race question. So in order to legitimize the violence in our streets and the mass uprising along lines of race, we are being told that that racism is still a fundamental problem. It has to be tackled so we can use these various means of addressing it, even including violence, because people feel as if things aren't changing. So we have a narrative of American history bereft of progress on race relations being promulgated by academics and activists. It's now taken up by corporations and governments. And in this account, all whites are portrayed as complicit in a stealth system of anti-black oppression. All whites enjoy white privilege, which includes a psychological wage by virtue of being born white. That's how you know. If you say, are you a person of privilege? That you know you are because you're born white. White supremacy is said to be America's original sin. It's in our national DNA. You've probably heard this rhetoric before. It's in the warp and woof of the American tapestry. And so can you unwind it? Probably not. So you might want to just toss it. So now we have the national anthem, but then we have the black national anthem played alongside it, because we're moving very rapidly to separatism, which is what we'd fought to break down successfully. I think I was born in 1962 and I was in high school in the 1970s. And I've actually had this conversation with my old classmates in black and white, and feel that we largely overcame this, but now it's back. And the act of denying it, so what I just said, that if I say that I don't think that this is a problem, if I deny white, not that I'm saying that there isn't racism anymore and that there aren't acts of discrimination, but if I deny the claim of systemic racism, of institutional racism, of racial oppression, white supremacy, white privilege, the original sin, because I'm an atheist and sin just doesn't have any doesn't have any meaning for me. It's a mythic notion. If we do that, this is tantamount to not merely an admission of racism, but to kind of a race recalcitrance, kind of a belligerence. And so you are being told, like, there are groups of people going into restaurants demanding that white people admit their guilt and take a pledge in support of Black Lives Matter. And if they don't, they're viewed as being the ones who are belligerent and recalcitrant. And and if they defend themselves, if they used to, when they're being aggressed upon and they defend themselves, their defensive violence is characterized as aggressive violence, because they're not supposed to resist in the face of this greater justice movement. This is the whole social justice logic. It's why Antifa can go out on the streets and beat up conservatives peacefully protesting and say they're protecting their communities, because speech is violence, and just the presence of these Nazis is warrants them engaging in quote unquote defensive violence. I want to keep their spaces safe. So whites are being asked to atone for the sin, to renounce oppression, to forfeit their privilege, and in so doing to affirm the existence of systemic anti-black racism. That's what you do. If you apologize for something, it means that you're admitting that you're guilty of it. All right. So if you're renouncing oppression, or denouncing oppression and renouncing your privilege, I should put it that way. If I'm forfeiting something, it must mean that and somebody can accuse me of it and they can take it from me, and I can I can insist on my innocence, or I can be silent, and that shouldn't be taken as an admission for guilt. But if I say, you're right, I do have privilege, I am racist, what can I do to help? Then you affirm that you're racist. If you deny you're a racist, they're going to argue that you're a racist. You're just in denial. I said, as I told you, the structures of institutional racism were long ago abolished, and it's illegal in the United States to discriminate against black people. So there's a machinery by which we can address this problem. We can take on this problem. So if a person is engaging in discriminatory act, or you have an organization which is engaging in discrimination, and you can demonstrate, intentionality, and that's not just them doing it on purpose. It can mean that they know it's going on and don't do anything about it, that they're negligent in enacting a law. That would be a crime of or an offense of omission. So in addition to an offense or crime of commission, then you can come up with remedies, and in fact, we have a systemic remedy. It's considered problematic by a lot of people, but at all levels of government, and it's practiced in corporations across the country. We have programs of reparations that have existed for decades, since going back many decades, but coming into regular order across the country by the 1970s. And it's what we call affirmative action, or in Europe they call it positive discrimination. We have federal funding for education, housing, and while those aren't specifically targeted to for the benefit of black Americans, they do disproportionately benefit black Americans. So there are far more poor than there are poor whites than there are poor blacks, but blacks are disproportionately on welfare, and disproportionately use public housing. And that's good. I support welfare, public housing, etc. So, but given that we have this history where we no longer have these structures of racial oppression, we got rid of slavery, we got rid of Jim Crow segregation, and given that we have these affirmative action programs, and we have a whole body of law that makes it illegal to discriminate against blacks, how is it that so many Americans have come to believe that systemic racism continues to shape American life? How does that happen? Why are so many Americans going along with the rhetoric that makes whites out to be racist oppressors and trashes the culture that has made America the envy of the world? And this is what I dealt with in my last podcast, where it's the so-called, white culture, which is actually Western civilization. It's not white; it's for everybody, but it gets said to be white. So how did this happen? So in place of actual structures of oppression and segregation, which are themselves, of course, as with other structures in the world, conveyed conceptually and theoretically. So if I'm talking about the natural world or the physical world or political economy and so forth and so on, there are real structures, and I talk about them conceptually and theoretically, and there can be different theories about how those things work and so forth. Just as those make apparent structures that may be unseen, ways of speaking about the world can also create perception that imaginary structures are actual and real. So we have to be very careful that our conceptual and theoretical language is attached to things that actually exist out there, right? Because terms, concepts, definitions, and theories and so forth can create. People often take the model of the solar system to be the solar system, right? This is the problem of what we call reification. And so you can even have the problem of reification to to certain degrees. Or we say that the IQ test represents intelligence. We talk about IQ as being intelligence, but IQ, the intelligence quotient, the G factor is emerges from a test. It's a test score. And so is it measuring intelligence? Well, we can have that conversation. But you have to be very careful about, or the idea of the rational actor in legal proceedings where, human beings behave in certain ways. You have a standard by which they're evaluated, and that's called the rational actor. But it's an abstraction, okay? But it does abstract from various features of social life, of moral acting. But sometimes concepts can refer to entirely imaginary things. So they may refer to real things, imaginary things, and the ability of human beings to always determine which is variable across time and space and across persons. And you can see the way this works in theological construction. So theology creates a universe where imaginary entities, locations and forces, gods, angels, devils, heaven and hell, evil and sin, these appear as real things. And people who subscribe to the cosmology that's painted by the doctrine, by the mythology, they think these things are real. They believe these things are real. They are made real through a language. So this is the process of reification. In this case, it's the most extreme form of reification, where the supernatural is transformed into perceived reality. Concepts substitute for actual things. They are only concepts. They're not concepts referring to actual things. They're concepts which are taken as actual things and stand for things that aren't actual at all. They don't exist. These things are not real. But they are believed to be real. And then what happens is that real events are interpreted within this all-encompassing framework. So when I see something happen that actually does happen, I attribute it to some mythic entity. Right? This is how people see disease and think of it as evil. Think of it as, demon possession of the contagion of evil. Right? So demonic forces are behind our troubles. And these troubles may be very real, but they're being interpreted in that framework. The framework makes a particular sense of the evidence that's in front of you. And this false account, the construction of a false account is given plausibility by being articulated by authorities. So in religion, the authorities are the church, the mosque, the synagogue, their ministers, imams, rabbis, respectively. There are prayers, rituals, and scriptures for religion to be successful. And it's build a congregation, acquire converts to doctrine. And this means mounting a successful program of inclusion and indoctrination. You got to get people together and you have to indoctrinate them, get everybody on the same page, believing the same thing. And when other people around you are believing these things and believe they're real, they become more real for you. So, as Freud said, sort of the difference between a delusion and an illusion. A delusion is when one person believes something that is outlandish. But when you have millions of people believing something outlandish, then it doesn't make it real, but it's not. You can't really say it's delusional. It's it's a psychiatric illness is at an individual level. I would argue that mass hysteria, you can scale this up. Moral panics. And when a program is societal wide, when it's pushed by society's major institutions, it becomes a very powerful force. So if you have in Muslim majority countries and the state adopts Sharia, so that Islam becomes not just the religious force but the political force, it's extremely difficult to escape that. And those who refuse and resist are said to be apostates. They are infidels. Those who criticize doctrine are heretics. And what I want to tell you is this description of theology and this is I talk about this in my sociology of religion class when I talk about religion and what its nature is and so forth. The description of theology that I'm giving you here applies to the doctrine of critical race theory. This is an ideology that guides not only Black Lives Matter in street-level action, but the anti-racism that we find in diversity training programs students, teachers, and workers are compelled to undergo in corporations, governments, universities. In many cases, one doesn't have a choice but to participate. This has become a rather societal-wide exercise. There's employment, grades, pay, promotion. These are all attached to diversity training. Knowing what happens to refusers and resistors, many more go along to get along. The principal targets in the training are white people. And they're told that they're racist even when they don't know it. So if you had somebody who didn't know what it meant to be a Christian and they said, well, you're a sinner, even if you don't know it, you're fallen, this is the truth. We need to get you in here. We need to talk about, we want to save your soul, so we need to talk about it. In critical race theory and in the diversity training based on this, and this is quite an old term, it goes, the idea of implicit unconscious race bias, white people suffer from this. They commit little murders against non-whites every day with their words, what are called microaggressions. And you can, again, see my last podcast, read my recent blog on this, where I talk about the features of white culture. And during the re-education experience, white people will learn to see the structures of racism that have heretofore escaped their attention, their perception. And they'll learn to see the unseen by acquiring a new way to talk about the world. They'll acquire an argot, a jargon. They'll be told to go into the world and promulgate this new gospel so others may see it. And they will be told to hold accountable those who refuse and resist the message, just as they'll be held accountable if they refuse and resist the message. So critical race theory and critical theory in general is part of the landscape in social science. I've talked about this. It's part of what I learned going through graduate school in sociology. It's part of what I teach in race and ethnic relations, in law and society. And I teach critical race theory alongside feminist theories, historical materialism, structural functionalism, symbolic interactionism, and many other theoretical systems. I want to emphasize, though, that I was sympathetic to critical race theory many years ago, and even while I was sympathetic to it, I never taught it uncritically in a classroom. And I now recognize that critical race theory is a toxic ideology. But even when I did it, my belief that higher education is no place for demanding conformity to a particular line of political thought always guided my classroom ethics. And so it's disturbing to me that critical race theory is being taught at all. In a way, I shouldn't say taught at all. Of course, I teach it, and we should talk about it. We should talk about it to criticize it. But the idea that it would be taught as a way of thinking, that you would use it to change attitudes and behaviors, that's troubling to me. I would never teach students that they're bad people for refusing to accept, say, structural functionalism or some other sociological theory, a grand theory, such as that one is, and there's others. I wouldn't want them to use something like that to explain their lives. I want them to know what it is, but I'm not going to tell them this is how they must see the world. I'm not going to attach grades to whether they sign up for, I have theories that I think are better than other theories, and I'll tell students that. It's my role to tell them which theories I think are the better ones. But the idea that any grade, some award or some punishment would be tied to their answer with respect to their opinions regarding whether they should adopt this for their lives. And doing it on the basis of race just adds an extra layer of horror to the practice. I mean, it's profoundly racist to say, okay, this is a race-based theory that you're going to subscribe to. And it would be very clear how horrible that would be if I said, this is white supremacy. Let's say I want you to subscribe to the theory that black people are genetically superior, white people are genetically superior to black people, and you'd be like horrified by that. The practice of compelling speech from administrators, students, and teachers and workers is tyrannical. It's entirely antithetical to the educational enterprise. And it's clear that anti-racism is a project to align popular consciousness with an ideology that elites find beneficial to some ends. It says the corporate power is backing anti-racist training, and it's anti-racist training based on critical race theory, and that tells us that the ends are not in the interest of working people, right? When corporations are saying we want everybody to be indoctrinated in this belief system, you should be very suspicious about that. And I find it highly promising that the White House Office of Management and Budget notified agency heads on September 4th of this year. It's just happened. The federal workplaces will no longer be allowed to conduct training that focuses on race theory and white privilege. The quote, "It's come to the president's attention that executive branch agencies have spent millions of dollars to date training government workers to believe divisive anti-American propaganda." This is Russell Vought. Or Voigt, I guess. It's not. I'm not used to the spelling, Vought, Voigt, but that's probably what it is. He says employees across the executive branch have been required to attend trainings where they're told that virtually all white people contribute to racism, or where they are required to say that they benefit from racism. And we can trace back the contracts for diversity training to at federal agencies. We can trace that back to an initiative started through an executive order that was signed by Barack Obama in 2011. It's the government-wide inclusive diversity strategic plan that this is part of, and that's issued periodically. As I understand it, in 2016, there's an order that focuses on what's called a new inclusion quotient, calling on agencies to, quote, "provide training in educational cultural competency, implicit bias awareness, and inclusion learning for all employees," end quote. Now, my position on this is that anti-racism poisons our workplaces by requiring white employees to align with values, align their values with the values of a worldview in which the work ethic and all the rest of it are degraded if you listen to the rhetoric. And in fact, I want you to listen. I want you to listen to this is Karlin Borysenko, and you can go out, and I'll provide the link in the comment section, and watch a podcast. She did a podcast with Trigonometry. It's an excellent podcast. You should check it out. And it's anti-racism training doesn't work. It's one of the best hours or so that you'll spend in your life learning about this. And she goes through all the ways, and you'll begin to, when you listen to this, you'll begin to put a lot of things together, and you'll say, well, that's quite odd. That's quite odd that rather than saying that we have high standards and we want people to be creative and be punctual and be efficient, and work hard and all those things. We're saying that white people do this. That's part of white culture. It's not part of black culture. Black people don't do this. This must explain the disparity. By the way, this was decades ago. This is the culture of poverty thesis. This was actually said to be racist thinking. The culture of poverty argument. And the reason why people are poor is because they have these different values. And here we have it actually becoming the basis of anti-racism training. It's very bizarre. And you should look into culture of poverty and study what that was all about. So when you say white culture, this is essentially modernization theory. So modernization theory says that you have these, you have this modern cultural, set of cultural values, and that if you adhere to them, you're your civilization will take off. If you don't, then you'll be stuck as third world, backwards culture. And people say, well, so you're saying that the reason people are poor is because they don't hold these values, and then these values, because they prevail in white majority societies, are said to be white values, and so they must therefore be racist. And this is how you, through steps, suddenly get to the opposite side, where it's an inversion of what was obvious to begin with. And so it's no longer obvious. Certainly treated as if the new interpretation is the obvious one, at least to people who are woke. Voigt's memo says there is that workers are being told, quote, that there is racism embedded in the belief that America is a land of opportunity, or the belief that the most qualified person should receive a job. So you have a system where people are being promoted based on the work they do, and then you take a look at that and you say, well, white people are in a position to be promoted, and you say, well, that must be white privilege, white supremacy. There's a system of discrimination. It's privileging white people, and you say, well, no, I mean, objectively speaking, the work is better. So then you say, well, then again, the standard must be set for white people. So we need to reduce the standard. We need to tell white people that they need to be aware that all the values that they hold, efficiency and punctuality and creativity and taking responsibility for your work and all that, if they hold these values, we have to tell them that those are the values of white supremacy, and so they should not do that. It's bizarre. And so this program of indoctrination is not just harmful to whites that are compelled to participate. It's harmful to blacks as well. It treats them as members of a group that can't measure up to the standards of the society in which they live. It says that in order for blacks to succeed, the standards have to be changed, lowered. Whites have to refrain from working with these standards in mind, that these standards are racist. Borysenko says, I can take any of these situations that are supposedly said to be antagonistic along lines of race, and I can show you that they're the typical kinds of things that in the workplace that individuals struggle with. You're always going to have conflict in the workplace between individuals. You don't racialize it. There's always going to, even if you just take white people, there's going to be white people who are going to work really hard and be successful, and white people who are not going to work as hard. And so what you want to do is, you don't want to say, okay, nobody work as hard. What you want to say is, how can we help bring everybody up to this level? Now, as a person who cares about labor, as a person who is interested in economic inequality and class inequality and so forth, there's something to saying that we work too hard. There is some dysfunctional aspects to hard work, but we live in a capitalist society, and if you want to get ahead in a capitalist society, then being creative and being a self-starter, being responsible for your actions, it makes sense in that context. Right? And it's not as if the modern left is wanting to engage in class struggle. They're not struggling over that question. They're defining everything in terms of race. So the problem remains. So anti-racism represents a massive project of social engineering that's being imposed on the American population without their consent. It's meant to change American culture. American culture is not intrinsically corporatist. It's not intrinsically capitalist in that sense. American culture is small r Republican, small d Democrat, small l liberal. The values that allow individuals to excel. So if you read my blog, you'll be familiar with my criticisms of Robin DiAngelo, or Concept of White Fragility, Ibram X. Kendi and his instructions on how to be anti-racist. But readers should know that the rhetoric comes from corporate psychology. That's where it comes from. So here's a bombshell for you. This chart used by the Smithsonian on whiteness that I took apart in my last podcast, and go back and look at that so you know what I'm talking about there. They did take it down. But it was adapted from a 1978 book, White Awareness Handbook for Anti-Racism by Judy H. Katz, who you see there on the screen. And it's not that the Smithsonian chart and our book share points of contact. The verbiage of the chart, that's the controversial white culture chart and the Smithsonian exhibit on whiteness, the verbiage of that chart's lifted from this book, a book that's more than 40 years old. To save us time, and Lord knows we've wasted, or I should say, I've wasted enough time reading DiAngelo and Kendi. It's just shocking to me that these are best-selling books. I mean, Kendi's actually out there saying, I want to remake the world in terms of my ideas, and people are actually listening. Katz's book is usually summarized by social work research and abstracts, and I'll just read it quickly. What are we at? We're at 53 minutes, so it looks like I might go over an hour here. A group training program is presented in which white people work together in non-threatening environment to alter deeply ingrained, often unconscious racist attitudes, and then embark on a program of behavioral change. The program has been used with measurable success in many settings. It can be adapted to the specific setting and needs of participants. After an introduction explaining the principles on which the program is based, the detailed step-by-step training format is presented. There are 6 group experiences. They're called stages. This is an indoctrination program. You center on the following themes: racism, definitions, and inconsistencies. So we'll tell you what racism is. So first of all, our worldview. Confronting the reality of racism. So it's really real. So this is what racism is, and it's really real. We're going to define it. And it's the whole critical race theory and the sociological construct of institutional racism and systemic racism are then presented. And we'll deal with feelings. That's pretty tough to learn that this is 1978. I thought we went through all of that, and, no, it's still here. And I said this before. I mean, Stokely Carmichael rolls out the concept of institutional racism at a moment when institutional racism is dismantled. So they were already ready to keep to replace the progress, right? The history of progress with a mythical structure. Then there's cultural differences, and indeed. There's occupational and residential segregation. This is a country that has a split labor market. There's all kinds of problems to be solved. And these are labor questions. Didn't solve them. In fact, they were buried by mass immigration and globalization. And then exploring cultural racism. So this introduces, and I've blogged about this as well, this introduces a whole new notion of racism. So racism isn't about biology. It's not about sort of constitutional differences among populations. Now it's culture. So, we can say there's black culture and white culture. And along with that cultural racism then is the meaning of whiteness. So we're going to define what that means. Then we have individual racism. And then we're going to develop action strategies. And the most successful training programs are ones that actually have you do things. They have you exercising, going out and doing it, and then having some way of making sure that you do it. If you've ever been involved in any sort of collective action, I've been a member of a labor union for many, many years, and so you always say, okay, here are the things that we would like to do. Okay, but now let's make sure that we do them. And so you have a whole process by which you are able to then, check up on people, make sure they're doing what they're supposed to be doing. Now, Katz's work has a deep intellectual background. It hails from, I said that it was corporate psychology, and specifically it's what's referred to as applied organizational psychology. And that's a technology that's designed to align the consciousness of workers with corporate ideology. This is a much larger process of taking employees and getting them on board. So this is how employees, it's just like being socialized into any structure of oppression, any structure of domination. And this is all legal. I'm not imagining, these aren't imaginary structures. I mean, the labor contract's a real thing. When you work at a corporation, you're really physically there. It really does exist. It's a legal entity. Class structures are real. You have a relationship to the means of production. That's all for real. And all of this, with organizational psychology, applied psychology, and human relations, and so forth, are hallmarks of progressivism. This is the technocratic worldview of the white collar sector. And I've blogged about the difference between progressivism and populism. A lot of people on the left today, most people on the left today, say they're progressives, and it's true, they are. They seem to think that progressive means, sort of social democratic or something like that. But I'm a populist, and that's a very different thing. Populism is about democratic control. You don't submit to control of corporations. In progressivism, you do. That's what progressives have accepted corporate rule. Even while they're being critical of capitalism, they really find themselves in corporations and quite comfortable in that nest. So one of the, or perhaps the leading person was psychologist Kurt Lewin. He's a central figure in this. Ron Lippitt, Ken Benny, Lee Bradford. Those are some other persons. They were associates of Lewin. They founded the National Training Laboratories, what's called the NLT, and this is the Institute for Applied Behavioral Sciences. And they founded this in 1947, and they established corporate training regimes. The methodology called T groups, training groups, or encounter groups, or sensitivity training groups. You may be familiar with some of these names. They also founded the Journal of Applied Behavioral Science. And the direction was associated with the human relations movement that was led by Douglas McGregor and others. And this was a movement that profoundly shaped corporate management strategies. And since the structure of capitalist societies compels the population to work for income, individuals are forced into structures that risk producing a subjectivity that's contrary to the material interests of their social class. So as a working class, you have a set of political interests. They root in material relations. These are objective interests of your social class. So you're in a social class whether you're aware of it or not. But your subjectivity can be shaped in such a way where you feel like, if you think about the switch in the language from worker to employee, by to employ means to use. So when you start thinking about it that way, it's not a very good word, right? So how about associate? So we make a person feel like they're part of something. They're not. Your labor's being exploited. That's the relationship. And human relations and workplace training regimes are designed to proactively integrate workers with this subjectivity. So it's to get everybody on board. So I'm sure some of you gotten a job and you sit down, they show you these training videos, and they integrate you. It's a community. It's a family. That's some of the language that the big corporations use. We're a family. So deploying various social, behavioral, cognitive strategies, they use small group interaction, role playing, that sort of thing. This assimilation into the corporate logic, social logic of corporations. Corporatism is the ideological part of the political economic manifestation of corporate power. Assimilation is obtained via various brainwashing techniques. They lever behavioral, cognitive sciences to transform people into compliant corporate citizens. And there's an analogy in all this. It should, and I think if people grasp this, the horrifying reality of this would shake them out of the daze. I want to be optimistic about it. But in the Chinese Cultural Revolution, what was called the struggle session, a victim would be forced to admit to wrongdoing. They'd be drawn out and forced, but to confess to a crime, a public confession. But these were often conducted at the target's workplace, and they would be surrounded by fellow workers who would join in, taunting them, break them down. So the encounter session in the corporate West is essentially a type of struggle session where a facilitator conscripts employees into coercing other employees into accepting this functional subjectivity. And that parallel should frighten anyone who cares about human freedom. And this is not an analogy. Really, bureaucratic collectivism and corporate bureaucratic organizations share an affinity of externally imposed rationalization. So it's not about you being, finding ways of being efficient and so forth and rising above. These are impositions, efficiency. You do it the way the corporation says do it. Predictability, uniformity, control. It's a vast bureaucratic machine, and you become a cog in it. Max Weber, the famous German sociologist, in his Prostenethik in the Spirit of Capitalism and other writings tells us about this, and it's eerie given that he wrote this at the beginning of not the last century, but the century before that. The Chinese communist system dovetails quite easily with the transnational corporatist order, and that's not theoretically supposed. We're seeing the convergence occurring before our eyes. The corporatist, the technocratic, progressive, the globalist wing of the corporate class is working hand in hand with China, and which has imperialist ambitions. Kind of as I've talked about this before, it's kind of a neo-feudalist global order that's emerging. The establishment media is mainstreaming and normalizing a cultural revolution. That's why. So Black Lives Matter, street level action, anti-racism training is indoctrination programs, these struggle sessions in our institutions. In this moment of historical reckoning, many Americans are being introduced to such concepts as intersectionality, white fragility, and anti-racism. That's essentially a quote from David Remnick. This is the introduction to his podcast with Isabel Wilkerson, who I've talked about before in a past podcast. This is for the New Yorker. So see the problem with good white people. See that podcast. This is not a moment of historical reckoning. They're making it into out to be that, but it's not that. This is academic jargon that's shaped by corrupting ideas of critical theory and postmodernism. It's constructing a reality that isn't really real. This is a mythology. This is a new religion. And the very notion of historical reckoning is a mystification. The real reality is that we're in a struggle between those who believe in republicanism versus those who believe in globalism. Those who stand for democracy and those who stand with the technocracy. So the question is whether we want to live in a society that protects individual liberty and defends civil rights in the context of a nation state that's answerable to the people, and an international legal framework that defends human rights as a universal standard of regard. By the way, universal human rights goes away when you have group-based rights, because then rights are determined in the context of culture. It's a very romantic notion over against the rational notion of Western society. Or do you want to live in the tyranny of transnational corporatist rule? A rule that works hand in hand with the Chinese Communist Party, because that's the historical moment we're living in. That's the reckoning. That's now. Black Lives Matter is street-level action in what is corporatist revolution from above. It's being carried out at all levels. And that's the real fascistic threat to humanity. People need to wake up and understand that. That's a different kind of woke. And so what we're seeing over the last several decades is a shift from old left politics, or what we might call, following C. Wright Mills, plain Marxism, or what I call classical Marxism. And I've been representing this for years now, which seems to have really confused people who thought they knew how to represent my politics in their minds, to new left politics. That's the shift to neo-Marxism, which works against the humanism, liberalism, secularism inherent in classical Marxism, the materialist conception of history and politics associated with that. This derangement represents the corrupting influence of Heidegger, Nietzsche, other regressive and authoritarian spirits, particularly those that are refracted through the prism of French thought. Now, I'm not going to go into any detail here. I've talked about this at great length on my blog. The New Left counter movement against democracy, nationalism, republicanism dovetails with the bureaucratic corporatist project of globalization or transnationalization, as well as the bureaucratic collectivism of the Chinese Communist Party. There's a common desire that emerges to denationalize the West and establish a global neo-feudalist order. So the latest OMB memo out of the White House instructs federal agencies to identify all contracts for diversity training that covers critical race theory, white privilege, and other training or propaganda efforts that teaches or suggests that, one, that the United States is an inherently racist or evil country, and two, that any race or ethnicity is inherently racist or evil. That's a start. But we need to reckon the moment we're in. And we need to understand that anti-racism training is part of a much larger problem facing the working class. And that's the problem of transnational corporate power and the restructuring of Western societies. Thanks for listening.